One of the things that I found as a journalist is that every problem you face in an article you're working on can be solved with more reporting. By calling somebody else, by filing an additional information request, what have you. Just more information is the best way I've found to write your...
Ben Goldfarb, environmental journalist, editor, and Beaver believer, has written for multiple publications, including renowned science journals Scientific American, Nature, National Geographic, Smithsonian, and Audubon magazine. He is here to discuss his award-winning book, Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. What many think of as a troublemaking rodent is a sincerely misunderstood ecosystem engineer. Beavers create wetlands and make conditions favorable for many animals to thrive. Beaver populations gradually diminished through a 3-century killing spree that began in the 1500s and was exacerbated by demand for fur coats and hats. The ecological results were disastrous. It's astounding to think of how areas of our country would look if that didn't happen. Those odd aquatic mammals considered pests in some circles are actually vital to the survival of our planet. Like lions and sea otters, beavers are a keystone species whose existence supports an entire ecosystem. Removing beaver dams, while a short-term fix, can promote longer-term problems. And relocation advocates, such as the Lands Council here in Spokane, are proving that beavers can be managed as problem solvers. Ultimately, what is needed is respect for the environment restoring beavers and their behaviors, for their own good and for ours. Eli Francovich, Spokesman-Review Outdoors editor, will lead the conversation as we talk about this evolutionary mammal. Please welcome Ben Goldfarb and Eli Francovich to the Northwest Passages stage.
I like your hair, Ben.
And yours, Eli. Thank you.
So, yeah, thanks so much for coming. I read your book and I loved it, and yeah, just like opened my eyes in a lot of ways. I'd never really paid attention to beavers and their affect before, so really appreciate that. And I guess I just wanted to know, how did, tell me the kind of the story of this book, and how did it come to be?
Yeah, and first I just wanted to quickly say thank you to Rob for that enthusiastic introduction, and to you as well. You know, your environmental coverage is just a critical resource for the community here. So I'm really happy to be talking to you in particular, Eli. So how did the book come to be? Well, I think like a lot of people who grow up hiking and camping and fishing, you know, I certainly been around beavers, had some baseline appreciation for what they do, but I didn't become a true beaver believer until 2014 or so. I was living in Seattle, working for the magazine High Country News, and was kind of casting, and was sort of casting about for things to cover. And somebody forwarded me an announcement about a beaver workshop happening up in Everett. And I didn't know what a beaver workshop entailed, but I knew it was a story, and I had to be there. So I went to this beaver workshop, and there was just this kind of parade of scientists, of biologists and ecologists and hydrologists and fluvial geomorphologists talking about how essential these animals are to our landscapes, and how bringing these animals back can help us restore salmon runs, store water in the face of climate change and drought, improve water quality. It was this incredibly eye-opening experience, just seeing how many different researchers from different fields were all on the beaver train. So that ultimately led to a couple of High Country News articles, and those were the germ for this book. And
you had been covering science, you'd been a science journalist for a while at that point, right? But beavers were not on your radar then, or just you didn't quite see their full effect until you went to that conference, or tell me about that.
Yeah, I think that in some dim part of my brain, I probably recognized that the beavers had entered the zeitgeist in some way, but I didn't. You know, I think like a lot of people, I thought of them as kind of these cute, interesting rodents, and not as the landscape scale forces of ecological change that they really are.
So you covered that for High Country News, and then
Right.
how did the book come to be? What was the next step with that? And then I'd like to hear about how you just approached writing that book and covering this subject.
Yeah. So the book was so serendipitous. So my publisher was Chelsea Green Publishing in Vermont, and to their credit, they also recognized this growing national interest of beavers in beavers, and one of their editors kind of cast about the internet looking for somebody who had written about these animals, and found my stories and sent me this email saying, "Hey, you have a proud love of the beaver," with the words they used. Yeah. And I said, "Yes, I do in fact have a proud love of the beaver." And
do you have that tattooed anywhere?
It's nowhere that I can show this audience. And I said, "Yeah, this is a thing that I could think about for several years and write 300 pages about," and it turned out to be so.
That's great. And so we'll get into more of the science of it, of course, but the book, one thing that struck me about your book was there was a lot of humor in it, right? And I was laughing out loud at points. I mean, was that a conscious decision, like you wanted to get into that, or just tell me how that happened? Yeah,
beavers they're inherently comedic animals, right? I mean, Rob can't even say the word beaver without cracking up, right? I mean, they're these fat, smelly rodents. They're a euphemism for the female anatomy. You just have to lean into the inherent comedy in beavers, I think. So that was definitely a deliberate choice.
Yeah, well, you did it very well, I thought. And so now tell us a bit just about what about beaver behavior sort of sets them apart from other animals, and really, as you go on to show in the book, it makes these big, profound, system-wide changes to the ecosystem.
Yeah. So I mean, beavers. It's every animal has an important role to play in its ecosystem, right? But beavers truly are keystone species, as the video put it. So what do beavers do? Beavers build dams, of course, right? That's the one fact about beavers that everybody knows. And the reason for that is that a beaver on land is kind of this fat, slow, smelly meat package, right? That gets eaten by wolves and cougars and bears. So by building a dam and creating a pond, they're creating their own shelter, right? Here's this big, deep pool where they can be safe from predators. So instead of having to walk overland to that good-looking aspen tree, they can swim up to it instead and be comparatively safe. That's truly a unique behavior in the animal kingdom, right? No other creature builds dams and modifies their environment to that extent, besides humans, of course. Unlike humans, our dams, as we're discovering in the Columbia Basin, of course, tend to be generally detrimental to other forms of life, right? Whereas beaver dams are incredibly important habitat for all kinds of creatures. You've got the baby salmon and trout that rear in those beaver ponds. You've got the frogs and salamanders that breed in them, the moose that feed in them, waterfowl, songbirds, bats. It's hard to name an animal that doesn't benefit from these habitats in some way, because of course, we live here in the arid inland Northwest where water is life, right? And, and wetlands are only 2% of the total land area, but support 80% of the total biodiversity. So you've got these animals that engineer these wetlands and turn out to be incredibly important for sustaining all other life in the American West.
Yeah, and you said at one point in your book, I think it was early on, even sort of, for me at least, it set up how I was going to think about beavers throughout, but you said beavers, it's a verb, right? It's not just a noun. It's sort of how you presented it, or maybe a biologist had said that to you.
Right.
And are you referencing just their ability to change the landscape and alter? Is that sort of that, or is there more to it than that even?
Yeah, so I was really borrowing that coinage from Brock Dolman, who's a great ecologist in California, and the point that he makes when he uses beaver as a verb is that beavers create processes, right? So a beaver builds a dam and creates a pond, and over time, that pond is slowing the water down and all kinds of sediment is basically settling out of the water column as the water slows, and gradually that pond is filling in with sediment. And at some point, it sort of ceases to be a pond and becomes something more like a wetland, and then it fills in further still and becomes a wet meadow. And then then trees start to regenerate, and the beavers have moved on by this point, and now it's once again a stream moving through a forest. So at each of those stages, from pond to wetland to wet meadow to forest, it's sustaining a different set of animals, right? A different set of plants as well, of course, an entirely different ecosystem. So that's the process that beavers set in place, is sort of this successional process of different habitat types over the course of years, decades, even centuries. And I think that those kinds of dynamic processes are something that our human-dominated world is missing in some ways. We like a static environment, right? We like our roads and our farms and our towns to kind of stay where we stick them. We don't tolerate dynamism very well, which is why we've suppressed fire for the last 100 years. But I think that beavers and fire are kind of playing similar roles on the landscape, in that they're both these forces of disturbance and successional regeneration over the course of many years.
Right. And we've been living without beavers in much of the U.S. and the West in particular for a long time, right? A couple hundred years.
Yeah, so the kind of the history of beavers is really that. So the kind of the first fur traders arrive in North America in the early 1600s and just spread westward across the continent, eradicating beavers to turn their furs into hats. In every pond, lake, river, and stream that they encounter, moving west across the landscape, and by the early 19th century, beavers were being exploited pretty heavily in Washington, and certainly by the late 19th century, they were basically gone.
So I guess considering that, I'd ask you, what would the Spokane region, look like if it was fully beavered? And same question for the West.
Yeah.
More broadly.
Yeah, so I haven't lived here for very long, so I'm not like Jack Nesbitt. I don't have a wonderful place-based knowledge of this area. But I remember so vividly my first spring here was just this spring, seeing the confluence of Hangman Creek and the Spokane River, and Hangman Creek just looks like chocolate milk, right? And that's all of this sort of agricultural runoff from the entire watershed. And to me, that's a fantastic example of a system that was historically beaver rich, right? I mean, today it's this kind of single-threaded canal, essentially, that's basically denuded of vegetation and just runs like a straight string, basically, through that valley. But historically, Hangman and so many of the streams around the West would have been these complex, multi-threaded, braided channels with ponds in some places and wetlands in others, and the river constantly overflowing its banks and spilling onto its floodplain. It would have been such a much more dynamic, complex place. We were in the Methow Valley this past weekend, and we were talking to another beaver biologist there who said that historically. Many of the explorers who came to Washington didn't know which way many of the rivers were flowing because they were so backed up by beavers. Yeah, it was such a complex environment, and that's what the American West would largely have looked like, pre-colonial arrival. There are just amazing accounts of places that today we think of as desert, like southeast Wyoming, and parts of Utah. You read these old trappers and explorers journals, which is a lot of the research I did for the book, and they're describing these lush marshes filled with waterfowl. It's just a completely different landscape back when it had beavers. And the challenge is, how do we get back to that place today? Because now we've colonized so many of those beaver habitats that I'm not sure how much re-beavering the landscape can support today, and that's why the work of the Lands Council is so important, trying to bring these animals back to the places they were eliminated from.
I guess I have one kind of off the script question, but So like Spokane River, larger rivers, how do beavers interact with those kind of larger, faster moving bodies of water?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that one kind of misapprehension about beavers is that they're these sort of like tireless builders, right? They're busy beavers, but beavers are actually they're kind of lazy in that they would much rather live in a place where they don't have to build a dam, right? I mean, they're building the dam to create deep water to provide their own shelter. But of course, in the Spokane River, the water's already deep enough, right? They're already well sheltered there. But of course, beavers live quite happily in the Spokane River. You see them all the time, which is very cool. So what are they doing in these big rivers? Well, they're basically constructing bank burrows, right? They're tunneling into the banks, and they're making these, kind of in some cases quite elaborate, multi-chambered burrows that they're living in. So they're not engineering habitat on big rivers in the same way. But those burrows are also still really important. There's a great PhD thesis done by a student at Humboldt State University where she actually snorkeled into the mouths of these bank burrows, which sounded very exciting, kind of like flushed the beavers out of there, which I'm sure they didn't appreciate. And she found all of these juvenile salmon actually sheltering in these watery burrows tucked into the riverbanks. So even when beavers don't build dams, they're still creating really good fish and wildlife habitat.
Wow. And so in Washington, you talk about in the book, I think you call it a sizzling hotbed of castor relocation or something like that, right?
I really have a way with words, Eli.
Well, I really like that. So Washington, as you wrote, is maybe the preeminent beaver kind of forefront of beaver enlightenment in the U.S.
It's true. We should all give ourselves a pat on the back right now. Yeah.
I mean, what does that look like, and why is that? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that we were excited to move back to Washington, or at least I was excited to move back to Washington for that reason. My wife was probably indifferent to
You
Washington
at least
status.
know a lot about beavers at this point.
She could be on stage right now. Yeah. Anyway, so why is Washington such a great place for beavers? Well, first, the biggest thing is that we have the best beaver relocation laws, and that's really, thanks in large part to the Lands Council, which was one of the groups that advocated for the Beaver Bill, which basically legalized beaver relocation, and the Beaver Bill has recently been revised. There's all kinds of beaver politics out there. Every weird niche has its own politics. So Washington has great beaver relocation laws, which allow you to live trap a nuisance beaver, a beaver that's clogging up a road culvert or flooding somebody's, wheat fields or clogging an irrigation ditch. You can live trap those problem beavers and relocate them to places that need beavers. And actually, in many states, that's generally illegal. California basically has virtually no beaver relocation, which is ironic because it's a place that could really use more beavers. So Washington has great beaver relocation laws, and as a result, there are so many different groups working on beaver issues here. Here we've got the Lands Council. There are lots of native tribes who are working on beavers. The Tulalip has a great beaver program. The Cowlitz started one this past year. There's the Methow Beaver Project, which is the biggest beaver relocation program in the state and probably the country, up in Winthrop, and a half dozen other groups that I'm forgetting. So there's just, it's a sizzling hotbed of beaver, or whatever the heck I said.
You stand by that.
I stand by that statement and adamantly reiterate it. Yeah.
And so, even so, my understanding is that in Washington we still kill more beavers than we relocate, or at least the state agency does. So I guess I'm wondering, what does that say about the broader kind of state of beaver relocation and coexistence in the U.S. if that's the case here in Washington, the sizzling hotbed? Yeah,
there's no question that anywhere you go in the country, there's lots of cultural resistance to the beaver movement, and some of a lot of that is understandable, right? Beavers. I was talking to people here earlier tonight who have beavers clogging up their culverts, and certainly they're a pain in the butt. they're a challenging animal to live with, and transportation agencies are often frustrated by beavers because of culvert blockages. Lots of farmers and ranchers don't appreciate them in their ditches. So there's still lots of cultural fear and anxiety. In New Mexico, for example, you can't relocate a beaver unless every landowner within a 5-mile radius of where you're putting the beaver says okay, and that's obviously impossible to achieve. So there are lots of people out there who resist beavers, and I think that the challenge of beaver restoration, right, is that so here you have this animal that's providing all of these wonderful public benefits, right? They're creating habitat for the fish and wildlife that we catch and hunt. They're improving our water quality. They're storing water for all of us in the face of drought. They're sequestering carbon for us, right? They're providing all of these wonderful ecological services to the public. But if you're a private landowner, they're pretty challenging, right? You're the one who has to go muck out the culvert or the ditch, or wrap your tree in a wire fence to deter them from chewing on it. You're the one who's bearing the cost of these animals that are providing all of these great public benefits. So we have to figure out some way to square those private costs with the public ecological services.
Yeah, and that seems like, that's really at the heart of a lot of conservation and ecological issues, isn't it? That there's these public benefits that are often carried by private individuals. There's a lot of examples, but I'm wondering, what have you seen that works in terms of addressing that and kind of bridging that tension?
Yeah, to me, the obvious analogy in some ways is with wolves, right? Here you've got this another keystone species that's a profoundly important player in its ecosystem that also engenders a lot of cultural fear, and the way that we've decided to deal with that public-private conflict, in some ways is through compensation programs, right? Paying ranchers for the livestock that wolves kill, and to me, I don't love that model, because you're basically saying to farmers and ranchers that, hey, these wolves are a cost to you, right? They're a problem for you. I think a kind of a cooler model is what they do in, I want to say Sweden, although maybe Chris knows more about this than I do, where they actually, if you're a rancher or a farmer and you have wolves bear a litter of pups on your property, you get paid for them. So you're
for the litter.
For the litter, right? For the wolves, yeah. So they're basically saying, hey, you farmers and ranchers, you guys are stewarding this valuable public resource on your private land. You deserve to be rewarded for that. In Mexico, there are programs where if you're a farmer and a jaguar. So they set up sort of motion-activated cameras on farmers' lands, and if a jaguar triggers that camera trap, and there's a picture of a jaguar taken on your property, you're rewarded for that. So
versus waiting for the animal to attack the cattle.
Exactly. So you're saying, hey, this wildlife that matters so much to all of us is it's a public good that is being stewarded by private individuals. And I would love, I don't know what the beaver analogy to that is exactly, but I would love to see some kind of program that in some way says to farmers and ranchers that these animals are benefits to all of us rather than costs.
Interesting. And I'm glad you brought up wolves, because you wrote about the interaction of beavers and wolves in Yellowstone, right? And I'd love to get into that a bit, the idea that there's this idea that wolves created these profound changes to the ecology of Yellowstone, right?
Right.
But you were saying it's actually a bit more complicated.
Yeah, everybody wants to talk about the frickin' wolves all the time, right? What about the beavers?
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck, right. Yeah, that's why I'm here, as a corrective to Nate Blakesley.
Right. You got a better room than Nate.
That's right, yes. Right, so the classic story of wolves in Yellowstone, I'm sure you guys have all watched the YouTube video about this, but basically, wolves were eliminated from Yellowstone by the National Park Service very deliberately in a previous, very misguided era of wildlife management. And without wolves around, the elk population exploded. The elk overgrazed the creekside willow and aspen and cottonwood. And yeah, it's a fair question. And all of these streams eroded, and it wasn't until wolves came back that they were able to thin the elk herds and chase the elk away from the rivers, and the willow could recover, and the stream banks could stabilize, and the beavers could sort of show up again as though they're like a little bit player, being benefited by the big mighty wolf, to me, that story is basically backwards. That when wolves were eliminated and the elk population exploded and the streamside vegetation was decimated, beavers disappeared. And that's actually what did the most damage to Yellowstone. It's really, it's amazing. You look at these old pictures of various drainages in the Lamar Valley in the northern part of Yellowstone National Park, and places that are today basically pasture land were underwater. Beavers had just completely submerged them. All of these little valleys were just these spectacular beaver pond and wetland complexes, and that hasn't come back yet. I think the popular narrative is that wolf reintroduction healed the park, but it hasn't. I guess the problem is that when you lose beavers from a system, those streams erode very rapidly. They incise, is what scientists call it, where you've got these two kind of towering stream banks, and the stream is trapped right at the bottom of the channel, and it's kind of been turned into this fire hose. And that's a system in which beavers can't really reestablish, right? If you're a beaver, you can't build a dam at the bottom of this really incised, deep cut
because
canyon.
It's moving too fast.
It's moving too fast, and if your goal is to spill water onto the floodplain to create a pond, the floodplain is hard to access because the stream bed is way down at the bottom of the canyon. So anyway, that's a lot of fluvial geomorphology, but basically the upshot is that when beavers left Yellowstone National Park, all of these streams eroded into a form that is very hard for beavers to recolonize, right? It's not like you can just bring wolves back and everything is magically fixed. Certainly wolves help, but they can't undo all of the damage, at least not quickly, that occurred in their absence. So to me, I think it's a bit misleading to say that Yellowstone National Park is healed now by wolves until we've got a lot of these historic beaver drainages filled with beavers again, and that hasn't happened. So, the wolves are great, but we need the beavers back there for sure.
And that is happening a bit in Yellowstone, right? There's some effort there.
Yeah, definitely. It is happening a bit, and they're coming back, and it's going to take time. And I guess the big question is how long can you wait for these ecosystems to restore themselves, right? If we want to wait hundreds of years, then beavers will make it back there, and the park will heal itself essentially. But if we want to bring historical conditions back in our lifetimes, then maybe some more active form of management is necessary, and that becomes a more of a values-based question than an ecological question, right? One of the really nifty tools for beaver restoration are these things called Beaver Dam Analogues, which are basically human-built beaver dams, right? You pound some posts into the stream bed, weave some willow through them, and you've kind of created this stable platform that beavers can build off of, right? It's kind of like a beaver starter kit. You're giving them a bit of structure to work off of. So, if we could build a bunch of Beaver Dam Analogues in Yellowstone National Park and really accelerate this restoration process, but, should we be meddling in America's most iconic landscape? That's a philosophical question more than it is an ecological question.
And what's that debate look like now? There's people obviously advocating for both.
Yeah, I think that the debate. I think that what's happening right now is very much let's just let the system heal itself, and I think that's a great position.
Interesting. And so I wanted to ask too. Throughout the book, you you do a really amazing job of making beavers, which were a mammal I didn't pay any attention to before.
What? Eli? Why
I
the
was
hell
thinking
not?
too much about wolves. So.
Typical.
Yeah. Eastern Washington.
Right.
So anyways, so you made beavers very relatable and sort of like, almost personable. And I know there's sort of two camps with that, right? Yeah, anthropomorphic, which I've been practicing saying that for a couple of days.
Good polysyllable. Yeah.
So I know there's, some people really push against that. Like, you shouldn't give animals human characteristics. They're very different than us, et cetera, et cetera. And I was wondering, how did you think about that going into writing this book and then doing what you did, which was made them very personable?
Yeah. I think two things. First, beavers just lend themselves to anthropomorphizing so neatly, right? We as Homo sapiens are sort of relentlessly driven to modify our surroundings. We build dams too, right? We impound water as well. We engineer the conditions for our own food and shelter. And beavers, unlike most creatures, do the exact same thing, and they do it in this very visible, spectacular way. So I think that's the first thing, is that you just can't help it to some extent, right? But then I think that the other thing that I think is I really subscribe to the philosophy of Frans de Waal, he's a primatologist and a wonderful writer. And the word that he coined, which is sort of the antidote to anthropomorphization, I can't say it either. It has so many syllables. Thank you guys. So the antonym to that he coined is anthropodenial, which is our tendency to deny other animals the traits that we bestow upon ourselves. To look at wolves and beavers and elk and and rainbow trout and say, you know what, they actually don't experience fear and pain and joy and love for each other. Those kind of higher emotions and cognitive abilities are really unique to us special human beings. And I think that is in many ways a much more dangerous idea than excessive anthropomorphization, is anthropodenial, because the more we learn about wild animals, the more we recognize that they are just so much smarter and more emotive than we've given them credit for, and are more like us than they are different from us. So I thought about that a lot too. Is let's not deny beavers abilities and emotions that they very well may experience.
And aside from the dam building and the environment changing, how do beavers, their family structures? I know that they have a pretty complex sort of social system, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's another reason that that they are so relatable, is that they live in these in these family units that are sort of, for better or worse, the kind of like the Platonic ideal of the American family, where you've got the monogamous, mated for life mother and father at the top of the colony. The colony is the beaver family unit, and then you've got the newborn kits, the baby beavers, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds. So you've got 3-year classes of offspring. Oh, are you guys just whipping this up as we go along?
We can go on. We can just talk about anything.
Yeah, no, I'm so impressed by the production values here. It's amazing. So you've got 3-year classes of beaver offspring all inhabiting the lodge together, and then those 2-year-olds during their second year, they disperse out looking for their own territories, like teenagers heading off to work or college. So yeah, you just can't stop, right? Yeah, exactly, right. The parallels are so obvious. Yeah. And so those 2-year-olds, that's kind of the most dangerous period of a beaver's life, right? They're loose on the land, getting into trouble, also like teenagers, and that's when a beaver is most likely to end up in a farmer's stock pond or irrigation ditch or a road culvert, when they're wandering around looking for their own territory, and I think those are the beavers that tend to get into trouble most.
Because they're actively looking and expanding and.
Yeah, and beavers are very territorial. They will fight at times to the death. Beavers that enter their territory. So if you're a 2-year-old beaver, living in an area with a pretty reasonable beaver population, trying to find your own little niche, it can be pretty dangerous and pretty hard to find an unoccupied territory.
Yeah, and I meant to ask this earlier, but tell us a bit about the beaver pelts and fur, and I mean it's pretty amazing what they're able to do with water resistance and repellent, and then also their lips. This is starting to sound very.
They're so kissable.
Yes. I wasn't going to say that.
Right. So beavers. I mean, they're just amazing animals. We talk a lot about what beavers do to the landscape as though they're like bulldozers. But I think I do think it's important to appreciate the beaver as this kind of evolutionary marvel. The lips thing. So they have a second set of lips behind their front teeth, kind of like a valve almost. So they can close this valve and then chew and drag branches underwater without drowning. I think that's a really amazing adaptation. And then their fur, as you said, they've got one of the densest pelts in the animal kingdom. They actually have 2 layers of fur. They've got and you can pet the Lands Council's beaver outside afterwards, maybe if Mike and Chris let you, and sort of see this. So the outer hairs are kind of the long, coarse guard hairs is what they're called. And then underneath that is the underfur, the beaver wool is what trappers call it. And if you looked at those under hairs under a microscope, you'd see that each one has a little barb or hook at the end, which makes them kind of lock together like Velcro. Which is this fantastic, waterproofing technique, and which is also what made them such valuable hat-making material. Because when you felt up that underfur, that beaver wool, that creates just this fantastic, malleable, durable, waterproof felt that was just all the rage in Victorian England.
Right.
The beaver's fur is this amazing adaptation, but it's also what ultimately led to their demise.
Right. Amazing. And so throughout the book, you had these amazing human characters, which the way that you kind of wrote about them was very compelling, and there's this whole culture right around beavers and beaver fandom, and I guess I just want to hear more about that. I mean, what's that like getting into that culture, and why do you think certain groups of people resonate so strongly with beavers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that one of the really wonderful things about being a journalist is that, you're never the expert, but you get to meet all of the experts, right? And I just feel incredibly fortunate to have had, hundreds of sources who were, so excited to tell me about their relationship with these animals, and I just feel, really, really lucky, including some of the Lands Council, who were just so forthcoming and engaging about what these animals mean to them. And I think that, I'm sure that every species has its constituency, its fan club, but I think that beavers have a bigger fan club than most, although not as big as goddamn wolves. But we're gonna correct that tonight.
Yeah. You can sign up to Beaver Dam after this.
Yeah. But I think one of the things that was so powerful to me when I was working on the book was, so I met lots of biologists and ecologists and hydrologists, right? Professional ologists. But there were also so many lay people who have gotten involved in beaver conservation. I met former real estate agents and physicians' assistants and child psychologists who just got roped in by these animals and are now some of the world's foremost beaver experts. And I think that one of the reasons that beavers have this power over people is just how engaging they are to be around, right? I mean, if and I'm sure there are lots of birders out there tonight, and so no disrespect to the birds, but if you go bird watching and it's a slow day that morning, you haven't really seen anything, whereas if you go beaver watching, even if the beavers aren't out and about, and they're usually not, there's still so much to see, right? I mean, first there's the incredible beaver infrastructure that is just mind-blowing to be around and is also so interesting to interpret, right? Like, why did they build the dam over here? Why did they dig that canal in that direction? Why did they situate the lodge where they did? There's just, even when the beavers aren't around, there's just so much interesting sign and structure to interpret. But then the other thing that's really incredible is just how much life is attracted to a beaver pond, right? I mean, even if you don't see the beavers, you're going to see 50 other species that morning. I mean, every time I go to a beaver colony, there's some new biological connection that I had never thought of. Like I was in Vermont last year after the book came out, doing some talks, and I went to a beaver wetland with Skip Lyle, who's a really wonderful beaver expert, and at this beaver wetland, beavers had cut down trees, right? So they'd opened up the forest canopy. So in New England, you've got these really dense forests, and beavers are one of the only forces capable of opening up that canopy and letting light reach the forest floor. So in this wetland, beavers had opened the canopy, allowed light to strike the forest floor. That had just catalyzed this amazing bloom of jewelweed, which have these beautiful orange flowers. And there were incredible swarms of hummingbirds that had shown up to drink from the flowers. So I've never seen a peer-reviewed paper about the beaver jewelweed hummingbird trophic cascade, right? Exactly, yeah. But when you're there, it's just unmistakable, and that's kind of the amazing thing about being around beavers is that you always see something extraordinary like that, and I think that's why they brought so many people into their orbit.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, and then in the last chapter, you talk about, and you mentioned this earlier tonight even, that part of the reason that beavers are so confounding to people is that they're not controllable, right? And we like to control nature. We like to have linear, whatever it is.
Right.
What can we as individuals and what can we as a community do to sort of change that orientation towards the natural world?
Yeah, I think that we have to. I mean, certainly in the case of beavers, we have to rethink what a healthy aquatic ecosystem looks like, right? I mean, I like to fly fish, and the places I like to fly fish are the kinds of places you would see in Field and Stream, right? Which are these straight, shallow, fast-flowing streams with gravel bottoms and no obstruction, where you can cast 50 feet in any direction. And those are really picturesque systems, but they're in many cases historically inaccurate ones, right? I mean, so many of these straight single thread, fast-moving, free-flowing streams were historic beaver impoundments, and they just would have looked completely different. There would have been, of course, the water would have been much slower and wider. There would have been canals shunting water all over the place. There would have been dead and dying trees everywhere. The substrate would have been, kind of mucky sediment rather than beautiful, clean cobble. It's just a completely different system, and not one that we think of as beautiful necessarily. So I think that's the first thing, is we just have to reorient ourselves and rethink what a healthy system looks like. And then I think, secondly, we have to be more willing to invite nature back into our lives. I mean, as you said, to to me, the theme of the book is that we've exerted dominion over all other creatures, and the story of beavers is sort of the story of outsourcing labor, right? Saying, hey, there's this, here's this animal that can fix our mistakes and heal the landscapes that we destroyed if we let them do it, right? If we kind of step out of the way and let the rodent do the work, as a lot of my Beaver Believer friends put it. So, and I think that's applicable to to all kinds of different ecological problems, right? I mean, it's fire is the example or the analogy that I used earlier, and to me, beavers are like fire, right? Fire is this wonderful tool of regeneration in many cases that we've historically suppressed, and we need to allow that that form of entropy back into our lives in some ways. So, yeah, let the rodent do the work is the takeaway.
Yeah, and finally, I mean, your book was so hopeful, and that's unusual for journalism, and particularly for environmental journalism.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, why so much hope? I mean, I really appreciate it as a reader, but why so much hope?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, probably like you, Eli, as an environmental journalist, I end up covering lots of bad stuff, and of course lots of bad stuff is happening, right? Species are going extinct, the planet is warming, habitat is being destroyed, you name it, something terrible is happening somewhere. And certainly those stories are enormously important to tell, and I enjoy telling them, but they're also, they get you down, and they're hard for you as a writer, and I think they're also hard on the audience. We're sort of bombarded with that negative news, and I think that stuff is also only part of the story, right? The thing that I always think about is just how far conservation has come, right? So on one hand, yes, we're in the middle of the sixth extinction and we're losing biodiversity constantly. On the other hand, 100 years ago, you couldn't see a beaver or a black bear or a white-tailed deer or a turkey in North America, essentially. We had virtually wiped all of those animals out, and now they're ubiquitous because they were subject to conservation laws that protected them and allowed their populations to recover. And we're seeing that with wolves now, right? Wolves are dispersing all over the American West, and that's an incredibly exciting thing. If you don't tell those kinds of conservation stories, I think you allow the people who oppose conservation to say, well, that stuff just doesn't work. Why even bother? And to me, telling hopeful stories like the beaver story is a rationale to continue and redouble our conservation efforts. And then I guess the final thing about beavers that's I think that the reason that the beaver story resonates now in particular is that whatever you think of the current administration, there's no question that we're living in a time when we can expect no conservation help from the federal government, right? But beavers they're this conservation cause that doesn't really require a whole lot of federal activity. The fate of beavers is being determined by private landowners, by town councils, by county commissioners, by state transportation agencies, by entities that are not influenced by the federal government. So during a time when the feds aren't doing a whole lot on the conservation front and are actively taking us backwards in many respects, beavers are a form of conservation that's very grassroots and bottom up and can be achieved at a hyper-local level. And I think that's a really important thing to hear about in this particular moment.
Wow. 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 Wow.